The blood hit the floor before anyone heard the shot. 1 second, Redwood Memorial's emergency room was loud with the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday night. The next, the lights flickered, every security monitor cut to black, and 3 masked men in body armor pushed through the trauma bay doors with rifles up. Staff screamed. A doctor dropped his chart and ran. Patients still hooked to IVs tried to pull free. And Rebecca Hayes, the nurse the hospital director had just thrown out 20 minutes ago, the one security had escorted to the parking lot like a trespasser, was already running back through the front entrance. If this story has you hooked already, hit follow and come along for the ride. I want to see how far this reaches. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's find out together how far this story travels. The shift started badly and got worse from there. Rebecca Hayes clocked in at 6:58, 2 minutes before her scheduled start, the same way she always did. She tied her scrub top in the locker room, ran a hand through hair that hadn't been properly cut since February, and told herself today would be unremarkable. She told herself that most mornings. It helped. Redwood Memorial Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Ashwick, a mid-sized city that had been trying to call itself a metro area for about 15 years without convincing anyone. The hospital was the largest employer in a 20-mile radius, and it knew it. The parking structure alone had 4 floors and a waiting list for permits. The trauma unit ran hot 6 nights out of 7 because the 2 closest alternatives were 40 minutes out, and rural highways had a way of producing emergencies that didn't wait. Rebecca had worked the trauma floor for 2 years. Before that was something she didn't discuss at work, and nobody had thought to ask. She was 31. She looked tired in the particular way that came not from laziness, but from years of sleeping in places that weren't beds, on schedules that weren't schedules, through noises that were never quiet. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. One of the veteran nurses, Dolores Marsh, had noticed it during Rebecca's first week, that quality of stillness in her hands even when the rest of the room was noise and motion, and had mentioned it once, almost to herself. Rebecca had changed the subject. This morning she walked onto the floor and picked up the first chart without being told to. "Room 4 is a hypoglycemic, been waiting 40 minutes, said Marcus, the charge nurse, without looking up from his station. "Room 6 is a chest pain, they're still running the EKG on. Room 9 is a kid with a broken arm and a mom who's already asked for the attending twice." "I'll start with 9, Rebecca said. "Kid first." Marcus finally looked up. "Dr. Kellner wants the chest pain." "Dr. Kellner is going to want the labs before he sees the chest pain. I'll pull them while I'm with the kid. Give me 20 minutes. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded. In 2 years, he had learned that arguing with Rebecca about clinical sequencing was rarely worth it. She was usually right, and she was never arrogant about being right, which was somehow more irritating than if she had been. The morning moved the way trauma mornings moved, not fast, not slow, but constant, with the particular texture of one thing immediately following another, so that time didn't pass so much as accumulate. Rebecca sutured a laceration on a 60-year-old man who was embarrassed about how he'd gotten it, managed a pediatric fever case, assisted Dr. Kellner with a cardiac stabilization, and ate half a granola bar standing at the nursing station at 11:15 before Marcus took it away from her and said she was making the residents anxious. "I eat standing up all the time," she said. "You eat like someone's about to take it from you. Go sit down for 10 minutes. She didn't sit down, but she did finish the granola bar. The trouble started at 1:15 in the afternoon. She was in the hallway outside the supply room when she heard the shoes, hard soles on linoleum, the specific rhythm of someone walking like their time was more important than yours. She knew before she turned around. Director Warren Gould was a compact man in his mid-50s who wore suits that cost more than 2 of Rebecca's paychecks and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. He had been running Redwood Memorial for 4 years. In that time, the hospital's billing efficiency had gone up and its nursing staff turnover had nearly doubled, which he considered a reasonable trade. Beside him was his assistant, a young man named Philip, whose primary function appeared to be agreement, and behind them were 2 men Rebecca didn't recognize. Not hospital staff, not medical, not security. They wore clean clothes and moved with too much attention, eyes tracking the hallway in a way that wasn't curiosity. She filed that away. "Hayes," Gould said her name like it was already a problem. You were supposed to submit your incident report from last Thursday by 8 this morning. I submitted it at 7:43, she said. Philip says the system shows it came in incomplete. Rebecca looked at Philip. Philip looked at his tablet. There were, several fields. I filled out every field, Rebecca said, keeping her voice even. If something didn't save on your end, that's a system issue, not a filing issue. I can resend the original. Gould's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it sharpened. He had a quality she'd seen before in men with too much institutional power, an ability to reframe compliance as challenge and challenge as insubordination, depending on which one was more useful at the moment. This isn't the first time you've had documentation issues, he said. I don't have documentation issues. You have 2 flags in your file. One of those flags is from a supervisor who left the hospital 8 months ago after an HR investigation. The other is from a scheduling conflict in March that was resolved in my favor. She paused. I've read my file. The 2 men behind Gould exchanged a glance. She noticed. Gould stepped slightly closer, which she understood as the move it was. You have a problem with authority, he said, quietly enough that the tone carried more than the volume. I've seen it since your first week. This institutional culture requires staff who function within a team structure, not, I function fine within a team. Don't interrupt me. Then say something worth waiting for. It came out flatter than she intended. Not cruel. She wasn't trying to humiliate him, but flat. The kind of flatness that came from 2 years of absorbing things and getting tired of absorbing them. The hallway had gone quiet. A nurse at the far end had stopped moving. One of the residents near the station was looking at his feet. Gould's face did something complicated. Then it settled. You're done for the day, he said. Security will walk you out. Consider this a formal suspension pending review. On what grounds? Insubordination and unprofessional conduct. In front of witnesses, she said. Not a question, not a threat, just a notation. Philip, call security. She didn't move while they waited. She didn't argue. She stood with her hands at her sides and her weight even on both feet and looked at a point just past Gould's shoulder, which was something she had trained herself to do years ago in situations where looking at the actual person would have given them something to react to. Security came. 2 of them, both men she knew by name, both of whom had the decency to look uncomfortable. The taller one, Davis, said, "Ma'am," in a quiet way that meant, "I'm sorry," without being able to say it. She gathered her badge and her bag from the locker room. She did not say anything else to Gould. She walked through the main corridor toward the front entrance with the steady pace of someone who was leaving on their own terms, even when they weren't. At the front doors, she stopped. Not because she changed her mind, not because she wanted a dramatic moment. She stopped because there was a vehicle in the hospital's emergency lane that didn't belong there. Dark, government plates, no hospital markings, and the driver sitting too still in the way that meant he was watching, not waiting. She kept walking. Outside, the October air was cold and flat, the sky the kind of gray that meant rain before evening. She crossed the visitor lot and sat in her truck, a '09 Ford F-150, with a crack in the passenger side mirror she'd been meaning to fix since April. And she pulled her phone out and looked at it without calling anyone. She had a text from a number she didn't have saved that said only 2 hours, maybe less. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the seat, then she said out loud to nobody, "All right, on." Inside, the hospital moved through the middle of the afternoon on its ordinary rails. The lunch trays had been collected. The second shift nurses were coming on. Dr. Kellner was dictating notes in his office. Marcus was managing a backlog at the station and trying not to think about the fact that Rebecca had just been walked out because they were already short-staffed, and whoever Gould pulled to cover the trauma floor at this hour would need an hour just to orient. The 2 men who had been standing behind Gould during the confrontation were no longer in the hallway. Nobody had noticed them leave. They had, in fact, taken the east stairwell to the 3rd floor, where Redwood Memorial's ICU occupied the quieter back half of the building, shielded from the noise of the floors below. The ICU had 6 beds currently occupied. 4 were routine. 1 was a post-surgical elderly patient. 1, bed 3, nearest the window, was flagged in the system under a restricted access code that routed any inquiry directly to a liaison number in a federal database. The man in bed 3 had been admitted 36 hours ago under a name that wasn't his name. His chart listed a traumatic injury from a construction accident. There was no construction accident. The two men who visited him now were not doctors, not family, not authorized hospital staff. When the ICU duty nurse, a young woman named Sierra, stepped away from the desk to check on a monitor alarm in bed 6, neither of the men was visible. The privacy curtain around bed 3 was drawn. It took 11 seconds. Sierra came back to find the curtain open and the patient's vitals on the monitor beginning to change in the particular way that indicated something had been introduced into the IV line that wasn't listed on the medication sheet. She called a code. She was doing the right thing, but she was already behind. The code alarm reached the security station on the ground floor at 2:41. Davis, who was still processing the paperwork from walking Rebecca out, heard it and stood up. He was looking at the monitor panel when the feeds cut. Not all at once. That would have been simple, a single point of failure. They cut in sequence, camera by camera, floor by floor, from the top of the building down in under 4 seconds. The last image Davis saw before the panel went dark was a corridor on the second floor, empty except for a figure moving fast toward the stairwell door. Not running, not panicked, but purposeful in the way of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had already accounted for what they'd find when they got there. He reached for the radio. He got 3 words out before the hospital's internal communication system made a sound like static and went silent. The backup radio, analog, battery-powered, supposed to be immune to this kind of disruption, made the same sound. Davis was a practical man. He had been in building security for 11 years. He had dealt with power outages, equipment failures, one bomb threat that turned out to be a disgruntled dietary worker, and a situation 2 years ago that the hospital's legal department had told him not to discuss. He was not prone to panic. He was, however, capable of recognition. And what he recognized in this sequence of events, the camera blackout, the comm failure, the timing of it, was that whatever this was, it was not accidental, and it was not over. He moved toward the front entrance. He got there just as the first military vehicle cleared the lot entrance. They came in a column, 2 tactical vehicles in front, an armored personnel carrier behind, and a 4th vehicle that wasn't military marked but moved in formation with the others. They pulled into Redwood Memorial's main lot without hesitation, taking positions that blocked the 3 primary exit routes from the building in a pattern that was clearly not improvised. Soldiers in full tactical gear stepped out. Not running. Moving with the economy of people who had rehearsed this, or something enough like this to translate. The lead element was already at the main entrance before Davis reached the glass doors. He pushed through them and held up both hands. "This is a hospital. You need to identify. Sir, please step back." The soldier, young, serious, with the particular stillness of someone trained to be calm in exactly this kind of moment, held eye contact with Davis without aggression. "We have authorization. I need you to go back inside and let the charge staff know to shelter in place in non-critical areas. Can you do that?" "What is this? What's happening?" "Sir, I need you to go inside." Davis went inside. Behind the column of vehicles at the lot entrance, a figure had stopped. A woman, on foot, who had apparently been walking toward the hospital from the direction of the visitor parking area. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a gray jacket, work boots with the laces done the particular way that meant habit, not style. She was carrying nothing. She had stopped at the edge of the military formation and was looking at the lead vehicle the way someone looks at a thing they expected to see. The soldier who had spoken to Davis turned. He looked at the woman. He looked for exactly 1 second, and then his posture changed in a way that was subtle and total. The shift of someone moving from operational mode to something that wasn't quite deference but wasn't far from it. He said something into his radio. From the 4th vehicle, the unmarked one, a man in tactical gear but no helmet stepped out. He was mid-40s, lean, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and reset without much fuss. He walked toward the woman at the lot entrance. They did not embrace. They did not shake hands. They stood about 3 feet apart, and he said something, and she said something back, and his expression shifted in the way of a man who has been moving fast for a long time and has just arrived at where he was going. Then he turned to the soldier nearest him and said one sentence. The soldier nodded. He raised his radio. He said, "All units, hold position. Command authority transfers to—" He paused as if checking pronunciation. "To Hayes." Inside, through the glass doors, Davis heard it through the soldier's radio as a tinny transmission. He heard the name. He stood very still. He thought about the woman he had walked out of this hospital 20 minutes ago. The way she'd moved, unhurried, the way she'd stopped at the door and looked at the parking lot like she was reading something. He thought about the crack in her truck's side mirror. He thought about her hands and how they never shook, and how he'd always thought that was unusual for a nurse. He thought, who is she? And at that exact moment, the first shot was fired from somewhere above the third floor, and the trauma bay doors blew inward, and the emergency room filled with the kind of chaos that only looks like chaos until someone who knows what they're doing starts moving through it. Rebecca Hayes came through the front entrance at a walk. She passed Davis without looking at him. She already had a radio in her hand. From where, he couldn't have said. She was saying something into it in the clipped, informationally dense language of someone used to communicating under pressure, stripping everything down to what mattered and moving before the reply came back. Behind her, through the glass doors, the soldiers were moving, and for the first time since he'd watched the monitors go dark, Davis understood something. Whatever was happening in this hospital right now, it had not surprised her. He looked at his empty radio. He looked at the corridor ahead. Then he followed her because there wasn't anything else to do, and because whatever came next, he had the instinct, fast and certain, the way real instincts come, that the safest place in this building was wherever Rebecca Hayes was going. She turned the corner toward trauma without breaking stride. On the third floor behind the ICU's frosted glass partition, Bed 3's monitor had flatlined, and the two men who had drawn the curtain were no longer there, and one of the ceiling tiles in the east corridor had been disturbed from below. And somewhere in the building, Davis couldn't have told you where, but he felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before you understand what it means. Someone was still inside who was not supposed to be there. The radio in Rebecca's hand crackled. She listened, her jaw tightened by a fraction. She said, "Seal the east stairwell. Nobody goes up or down until I say." A pause. Then, from the other end, "Copy that, Captain." Davis heard it. He stopped walking for half a second, just half a second, because she was already pulling ahead, and he thought, "Captain." The lights in the trauma corridor flickered once and held. Rebecca didn't look up. She kept moving. She didn't explain herself to anyone. That was the first thing the soldiers noticed. Not her competence, not the way she moved, but the absence of explanation. Most people entering a situation like this talked too much. They narrated. They justified. Rebecca Hayes gave directions and expected them to be followed, and the soldiers followed them the way you follow someone who has earned that response in circumstances you don't ask about. The trauma bay was 3 corridors from the front entrance, and it took her 40 seconds to reach it. In those 40 seconds, she gathered 3 things from the soldier who fell in beside her: a tactical radio set to the unit's frequency, a brief on the building's known breach points, and confirmation that the ICU patient in Bed 3 was alive, barely, the IV tampered with but caught fast enough that Sierra's code response had gotten ahead of it. "Who's on 3?" she asked. "2 of ours. 1 hospital security." "Davis," she said without asking, "tell him to stay on 3 and not let anyone through that isn't wearing a badge he personally recognizes. He'll know what that means." The soldier relayed it. Rebecca turned the last corner. The trauma bay looked the way it always looked after something broke through it. Not destroyed exactly, but wrong in the particular way of a space that had been orderly and was now not. 2 of the bay doors had been forced. 1 gurney was overturned. A crash cart had been knocked sideways and nobody had righted it yet, which told her the staff who remained were either in cover or had pulled back to the secondary triage area the way the emergency protocol specified. She checked the overturned gurney first. Nothing. No one under it. And then moved to the supply corridor that ran along the bay's back wall. She knew exactly where to go. The cabinet was where she'd left it, which meant nobody had moved it, which meant nobody had thought to look. It was a standard-issue hospital supply cabinet, beige, labeled linens on a piece of tape that had been there when she arrived 2 years ago. The combination was 4 digits she'd chosen herself. She opened it. The tactical medical case inside was compact. She'd spec'd it that way. Green canvas exterior, worn at the corners, with a compression strap she'd replaced twice. She pulled it out and set it on the counter and opened it with the efficiency of someone who had run this sequence enough times that her hands knew the order before her brain finished the instruction. The soldier in the doorway, young, maybe 24, with the careful eyes of someone still deciding how much he was surprised by, watched her. He didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. Then, "Is that a field medical kit?" "It's got a field medical kit in it," she said. "It's also got other things." She pulled a radio earpiece, clipped it to her collar, and tied her hair back with the elastic she'd had on her wrist since morning. "What's your name?" "Castillo. Specialist Castillo." "Castillo." When the second team came through the east entrance, which direction did they move? He hesitated. Not because he didn't know. She could see him working through how much to tell her, and she cut that short. "I have command authority as of 14 minutes ago," she said. "Your CO handed it over in the parking lot. You were standing 6 feet away when he did it." Castillo straightened slightly. "They moved north, toward the service elevators." "How many?" "3 that we counted. Could be 4. "It's 4, she said. "There were 2 in the building before your unit arrived. The 2 from the lot make 4. She closed the case, lifted it, and moved toward the door. "Stay on this corridor. If anyone comes through that isn't staff you recognize, stop them. You don't need to be polite about it." She was already gone before he could respond. The man who had met her in the parking lot was named Warrant Officer Dale Pruitt, and he had served under Rebecca Hayes for 2 years in a context that neither of them discussed outside of rooms that had been cleared for discussion of it. He was currently on the second floor managing the unit's perimeter spread, which was thin. They'd come in with 9 personnel, which was fast response numbers, not assault numbers, and the building had more entry points than he was comfortable with. He found her at the second floor stairwell landing. "Sit rep," she said. 3 floors to cover, 2 men on each critical point, 1 breach still unconfirmed on the west corridor. ICU patient is stable. They got the IV flagged before whatever they put in it reached a fatal dose. He paused. "It was close." "It was supposed to be close," she said. "They weren't trying to kill him quietly. They wanted it to look like equipment failure, but they didn't have enough time to make it clean. Someone moved faster than they planned." "Sierra, Sin," he said. "Sierra," she agreed. "Make sure someone gets her name." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. There was a quality to how he looked at her. Not admiring exactly, more like someone watching a piece of equipment function the way it was designed to function, which was itself a form of respect. "The other thing," he said, "you need to know." "Tell me." "We didn't come here just for the patient." "I know." "They flagged your name 2 weeks ago. Whatever these people are, they've been tracking your location since I took this job," she said. "I know, Dale." He looked at her. "You knew and you stayed." "I had reason to stay." She looked past him at the stairwell. "Are we going to talk about this, or are we going to handle the 4 people in my building?" He turned. "Building." They moved. "What?" The thing about a hospital under active threat was that it couldn't stop being a hospital. That was the part no training scenario fully prepared you for. The fact that the 23 patients currently admitted to Redwood Memorial still needed their medications, still had vitals that required monitoring, still had IVs and post-surgical protocols, and 1 man on the 6th floor who was 48 hours out from a bypass and whose blood pressure would become a problem if his stress response wasn't managed. The building couldn't go dark. The staff couldn't all shelter. Someone had to keep the machinery running while other people handled what was happening in the corridors. Rebecca understood this in a way that the soldiers couldn't, and it was why she'd moved through the trauma bay first instead of going straight to command position. She needed to know the floor. She needed to know who was still functional. She found Marcus at the secondary triage station with 4 nurses, 2 residents, and an attending named Dr. Harlan Voss, who was 62 years old, had worked at Redwood Memorial for 19 years, and was currently the calmest person in the room, which Rebecca noted and filed. Marcus looked at her. He had the specific expression of a man who had just recalibrated several things simultaneously. "You came back," he said. "Keys are still in my locker," she said. It wasn't true. She'd taken her keys, but it gave him something to do with the moment. What's happening? Active threat. Building is being secured. ICU patient was the primary target. Everyone currently in this room stays in this room. Who's on critical monitoring that can't move? Voss stepped forward before Marcus could answer. I've got post-bypass on 6, a respiratory case on 4 who's on a vent, and 2 post-surgical patients on 3 who are ambulatory but shouldn't be doing stairs. 6 and 4 are priorities, she said. Can you manage them from here with phone contact, or do you need to be physically present? 4 I need to see. The vent patient, if there's any disruption to power. Power stays on. I've got someone on the generator room. She looked at Pruitt, who was 2 steps behind her. He nodded once and spoke into his radio. You can get to 4. I'll have Castillo walk you up. Stay off the main corridor. Use the interior staff passage. Voss didn't argue. He picked up his stethoscope from where he'd set it on a chair and put it back around his neck with the manner of someone resuming a task that had been briefly interrupted. Marcus was still watching her. The residents were trying not to stare and failing. The director, Marcus said carefully. Gould. He left about 10 minutes ago, right after the cameras went down. She went still. He came through here? He didn't come through here. He left through the administrative corridor, the one that connects to the parking structure. Marcus's voice was measured in a way that meant he'd been thinking about this and hadn't known what to do with it. He had those 2 men with him, the ones from earlier. She looked at Pruitt. Pruitt already had his radio up. She didn't run. Running in a hospital corridor told everyone around you that the situation was worse than managed, and the situation needed to appear managed even when it wasn't. She moved fast and she moved with purpose, and she kept her expression neutral because there were people watching who needed to believe that someone knew what was happening. The administrative corridor was carpeted, a different building almost, from the linoleum and fluorescence of the clinical floors. It ran from the main administrative wing to a service door that opened into the parking structure's 2nd level. The door had a keypad. The keypad, according to Pruitt's man on the structure, had been used 11 minutes ago. She went through it. The parking structure was cold and smelled like exhaust and concrete. The 2nd level was about half full. The only sound was the ventilation system, and distantly, the noise from the military vehicles in the main lot below. She found the first sign at the base of the ramp to level 3, a phone, screen cracked, sitting face up on the concrete. It was Phillips. She recognized the case, a slim green thing with a corner peel he was always meaning to fix. She left it where it was and went up the ramp. On level 3, 2 of the parking structure's 4 ceiling lights were out, a maintenance issue that had apparently been reported and not addressed, which struck her now as possibly not coincidence. The dimness gathered at the far end near the stairwell door. She heard them before she saw them. Not Gould, the other 2. They were moving with purpose, and they were not trying to be quiet anymore, which meant they either believed they were clear or they'd shifted objectives, and neither option was good. She pressed against the support column at the ramp entrance and listened. 2 sets of footsteps. A door. The stairwell opened and stayed open. Then a voice, low and clear, with an accent she couldn't immediately place. He was on a phone. He was not speaking to her. She caught fragments, a time reference, a vehicle, a designation that was 2 letters and a number she didn't recognize but committed to memory. Then, the woman is still in the building. A pause, then, it doesn't matter. We got what we came for. She processed that. The patient was alive. The tampered IV had been caught. Unless, her radio crackled once, quiet. Pruitt, keeping it low. She put the earpiece to her ear without pressing the transmit button. His voice came through carefully, each word placed. Rebecca. The patient in bed 3. The chart we pulled. His name isn't what we thought. She waited. He's not the objective, Pruitt said. We've been looking at this wrong. He's the courier. What they needed wasn't the man. It was what he was carrying, and the ICU staff logged a personal effects inventory when he came in. She knew before he said it. It's gone, Pruitt said. Whatever he had on him when he came through your doors, it's gone. The stairwell door above her swung open again, and footsteps came down fast, and she had exactly 4 seconds to make a decision about whether to hold position or move. and 4 seconds was enough, and she moved. She got one of them. The second one she almost got. He was faster than she expected, Chuck, not trained exactly, but experienced in the particular way of someone who had done rough things in various buildings and knew how to create distance when they needed it. She had his wrist, and then she didn't, and he hit the stairwell door going backward, and it gave, and he was through it, and she followed him up 3 steps before a sound stopped her. From below, the first level, the hospital exit, there were 2 shots, close together, not suppressed. Then Pruitt's voice on the radio, stripped of everything except information. West exit, one of ours is down. Shooter is moving south toward the exterior. She stopped on the stairs. The man above her was getting away. The man below had just shot one of Pruitt's soldiers. She stood on the stairs for 1 second, one long, specific second, and made the choice that every piece of her training told her to make, which was not the choice she wanted to make, and she turned and went back down. She came out of the parking structure at a run. The soldier, Castillo, she registered with a drop in her stomach, it was Castillo, was on the ground near the west exit door, one hand pressed to his side and the other flat on the pavement because someone had told him once to keep his hands visible, and his body had remembered it even now. He was conscious. She reached him in 10 seconds and was already assessing before her knees hit the ground. "Stay with me," she said. "Talk to me." Yeah, he said, which was not informative but was a sentence, which meant his airway was clear and his brain was still running. "Right side?" Yeah. She had the case open. Her hands moved. "You're going to be fine," she said, and she said it the way she'd learned to say it, not as comfort, not as promise, just as the next piece of information he needed to have. Delivered in the same register as everything else, so his nervous system didn't have to decide whether to believe it. "The guy," Castillo managed, "he went south. There's a fence." "I know. Don't worry about him." "Captain, Castillo," she pressed. He flinched and held. "Don't worry about him." Above her, Pruitt arrived with 2 soldiers and took the perimeter. Below her, Castillo breathed in the careful way of someone being told by their body that something was wrong and choosing not to listen. She kept her hands steady and her voice even, and she worked. 3 floors up, in the room that connected to the administrative corridor, Warren Gould's desk phone was ringing. It had been ringing for 4 minutes. Nobody was there to answer it, and in the east stairwell of Redwood Memorial Hospital, behind a door that now swung loose on its upper hinge, something had been left behind. Not by accident, she would realize later, but deliberately, placed where she would find it. A thin plastic case, the kind used for encrypted data storage, with a piece of medical tape stuck to the front. Written on the tape in blue ink, in handwriting she didn't recognize. "You were never just a nurse." She found the case 40 minutes later. Not because she went looking for it, she went back through the east stairwell because that was the last confirmed movement of the second man from the parking structure, and she needed to close the loop on where he'd gone and whether he was still in the building. Pruitt had Castillo loaded into a vehicle and moving toward Ashwick Regional within 4 minutes of her finishing the field dressing, and she'd watched the vehicle pull out and then turned back toward the hospital because there was no version of this where she was done. The case was on the 3rd step from the bottom, sitting flush against the wall like someone had set it down carefully, not dropped, placed. She crouched and looked at it without touching it for a long moment. The medical tape, the handwriting, the fact of it being here at all, not hidden, not thrown, but left with the specific intentionality of a message. She picked it up, turned it over. No mechanism on the exterior. The plastic was standard encrypted carrier grade, the kind that required a key code or biometric to open. She put it in the interior pocket of her jacket and kept moving, because standing in a stairwell looking at an object was not a productive use of time, and whatever it contained had already waited this long. The east corridor on the 3rd floor was where she found the situation that reorganized everything. 2 of Pruitt's soldiers were holding a perimeter around the ICU entrance, which was correct. What was not correct was the 3rd person standing between them. Not a soldier, not medical staff, but a man in a hospital maintenance uniform who was approximately the wrong age for the maintenance staff she'd seen over 2 years and was holding himself with the particular controlled stillness she recognized at this point as someone who had been trained not to fidget. "Who cleared him?" she asked. The soldier on the left, Reyes, she'd learned names fast. She always had. Looked uncomfortable. He had a badge, Captain. Maintenance ID. Photo matched. How long has he been on this floor? He was here when we established the perimeter. We assumed. She was already walking toward the man. He watched her come without adjusting his weight, without looking at the exits, which told her he was either very calm or had already determined that moving wasn't his best option. "What's your name?" she said. "Tom Wilder," he said. "Maintenance? I've been here 4 years." "What's the boiler room access code?" He gave it without hesitating. She pulled her radio and confirmed it in 12 seconds. It checked out. She looked at him for another moment. The way he held his hands, the wear on his work boots, the fact that his badge had a small coffee stain on the lower left corner that was consistent with regular use rather than recent printing. He was maintenance. She'd been wrong, or close to wrong, which happened. "Stay in the ICU waiting area," she said. "Don't leave until someone tells you the building is clear." He nodded. He went. She didn't apologize, and he didn't expect her to. What she'd seen in the ICU stopped her for different reasons. Sierra was still at the desk. She had not left, which was either remarkable or unsurprising depending on how well you knew the kind of person who became an ICU nurse. The patient in bed 3 was alive and on a corrected IV protocol. His vitals stabilized, but hovering in the range that meant the next 2 hours mattered. 2 other ICU patients were asleep. One elderly woman near the window was awake and watching the hallway with the specific calm of someone who had been old enough to live through enough that this was not the worst thing she'd seen. "Sierra, shh," Rebecca said, coming to the desk. "He's stable," Sierra said immediately. "I know that's what you're going to ask." "It is. How long was the tampered line running before you caught it?" "Maybe 4 minutes. The alarm on bed 6 was a false trigger. I think now it was meant to pull me away. I came back faster than they expected because the alarm reset itself, which it doesn't normally do, so I went back to check and that's when I saw the line." Rebecca looked at her. "You caught it because something felt wrong." "It did feel wrong." "That matters. Write that down exactly the way you just said it, for the investigation." Sierra nodded, then quietly, "Who is he?" "The patient. His chart doesn't—" "I know. You'll get a full answer when I have one to give you." She glanced at the bed. "Keep the room status restricted. Anyone wants access who isn't you or Dr. Voss, you call me first." She gave Sierra the radio frequency and moved on before Sierra could ask the follow-up question she was clearly building toward, which was the right call, because Rebecca didn't have the answer yet, and saying so out loud in a clinical environment accomplished nothing. Pruitt met her at the second-floor junction at what she estimated was just past 4 in the afternoon, though her sense of time had compressed in the way it always did when things were moving. He had a look she knew. Not panic. He didn't do panic, but the particular tightening around his eyes that meant he'd learned something and hadn't decided how to deliver it. "Data case," she said, pulling it from her jacket before he could start. "Found it in the east stairwell. I need someone to open it. I've got a field tech in the vehicle. Give me 5. He took it. Then, "The shooter who hit Castillo." "What about him?" "We found him. South side of the property, against the perimeter fence. He didn't make it over." Pruitt's voice was flat. "He was dead before he hit the ground. 2 shots, neither of them from our unit." She absorbed that. "Someone cleaned him up before we got there. Whoever it was, they were already gone. So there's a 5th, at minimum." She looked at the ceiling, which was a habit she'd never fully broken, the way her eyes went up when she was running calculations, as if the answer were somewhere in the middle distance above her head. "The man in the parking structure, the one I almost caught. What was he trying to reach?" "There's a service road on the north side, connects to the highway access road about a 1/4 mile out. We've got a unit on it, but he's already passed it," she said. "He had a 10-minute head start through the structure. He's gone." She said it without inflection because it was simply true, and being upset about it was a resource she didn't have to spend right now. "What's our count on contained personnel?" 3 individuals in custody. 2 were taken in the trauma bay area during initial entry. They were the ones who breached the doors. 3rd was caught in the south stairwell trying to reach the basement. All 3 are non-communicative. "They won't talk," she said. That's not why they're here. I know. Then what are they for? Pruitt looked at her steadily. Noise, he said. Keep us looking at the breach while the real move happens somewhere else. She had already arrived at that conclusion 2 minutes ago, which was why the data case felt heavier than its actual weight in her jacket pocket. Whatever was on it, whatever the courier had been carrying when he walked into Redwood Memorial's emergency intake, was the center of this. Not the attack, not the breach. The thing they'd taken before anyone was looking, or she thought, the thing they'd left. Her radio crackled. Reyes, from the 3rd floor. Captain, we've got a problem in administrative. Mbakbot. Gould's office was on the administrative wing's far end, and it had been sealed when the building went into lockdown protocol. Or it should have been. The door was now open, and the reason it was open was standing inside it looking like a man who had made several decisions in the last hour and was currently unsure how many of them had been correct. He was not Gould. He was a man she'd never seen before. 50s, gray at the temples, in a dark suit that had traveled badly. He had his hands visible, which she noted, and he was standing in the center of the room rather than near the desk or the window, which meant he'd chosen a position that communicated, I am not hiding anything, and was aware that this was a choice communicating something. Captain Hayes, he said. She stopped in the doorway. Pruitt was a half step behind her left shoulder. You have about 30 seconds to tell me who you are and how you got in here. My name is Arthur Gaines. I'm with the Interagency Oversight Division. He produced credentials from his interior jacket pocket, slow, deliberate, keeping his hands visible the whole way, and held them out. I've been following this operation for 6 weeks. She didn't take the credentials. She looked at him. Which operation? Theirs or ours? Both? A pause. I need to speak with you alone. You won't be speaking with me alone. He seemed to have expected this. The patient in ICU bed 3 is a federal material witness. His name is Daniel Farrow, and he was carrying encrypted documentation, testimony, records, financial transfers, relating to a network that has been running medical procurement fraud through at least 7 regional hospitals over the past 4 years. He glanced at Pruitt, including this one. The room was quiet. The people who came here today weren't trying to kill him, Gaines continued. They were trying to recover the documentation before it reached the federal review panel it was scheduled to reach tomorrow morning. The attack was designed to look like an external threat, generate chaos, pull attention to the breach, while the real extraction happened in the ICU. They got it, Rebecca said. They got something, Gaines said. Whether they got what they think they got is a different question. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the patience of someone who had been waiting to say something specific. Farrow knew the risk, Gaines said. He's been in federal protection for 3 weeks. When he agreed to be admitted here under a cover identity, he insisted on a backup protocol. He didn't want the documentation in one place. Another pause, deliberate, waited. He asked us to identify someone inside the hospital he could trust, someone who wouldn't be on any watch list, someone who wouldn't be expected. The silence had texture now. He asked us to find someone who looked to the wrong people, like they didn't matter, Gaines said. Someone they'd overlook. Rebecca understood what he was not saying. She understood it the way you understand something when your body registers it before your mind finishes the sentence. A tightening, a settling, a recalibration. The case in the stairwell, she said. Is the backup copy, Gaines said. Yes. She pulled it from her jacket and looked at it. The medical tape, the handwriting. You were never just a nurse. He knew you were here, Gaines said. Your record is classified, but some people know what to look for. He looked. He glanced at the case. He left it where only someone who knew what they were doing would think to go. Someone who'd clear a stairwell properly instead of just holding the perimeter. She set the case on Gould's desk. She looked at it for a moment. Gould, she said. Where is he? Gaines's expression shifted in a way she didn't like. That's the other thing. Warren Gould had not gone far. This was, in retrospect, consistent with a certain type of person, the kind who had spent years operating in an institution with just enough authority to feel untouchable, making arrangements through layers of buffer that kept his name off anything that could be traced, right up until the moment the buffers failed, and he found himself standing in a hospital parking structure with two men whose job it was to handle situations like the one currently unfolding, and discovered that handling the situation meant something different to them than it did to him. He was in his car, level 2 of the parking structure, northeast corner, which was where his designated spot had been for 4 years. The engine was running. He had not moved. Davis found him, which was fitting in a way nobody had planned for. Davis, who had been holding the ICU level since Rebecca had told him to, had come down when Reyes confirmed the 3rd floor was secured, and he'd come through the parking structure because it was the fastest route back to the administrative wing, and he'd seen the car idling in the corner, and he'd gone to look, because he was a practical man, and idling cars in lockdown facilities were the kind of thing a practical man checked. Gould was sitting in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and his phone on the passenger seat and a look on his face that Davis had seen before. In the one prior professional situation he was not allowed to discuss. The look of a man who had just understood that the distance between involved and culpable was shorter than he'd been told. "Mr. Gould," Davis said through the window, "you need to come with me." Gould looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. "Davis, I want you to understand that nothing that happened today was—" "Sir," Davis said patiently, "I've been a security officer for 11 years. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm not asking you to explain anything." Gould came with him. He didn't argue, which was more telling than if he had. They brought him to the administrative conference room on the 1st floor, where 2 of Pruitt's soldiers were waiting, and where Gaines joined them within 10 minutes, and where Gould sat at the head of a table he'd chaired 100 times, and looked substantially smaller than he ever had in any of those meetings. Rebecca did not go to the conference room, not because she wasn't needed, but because there was something else that needed doing first, and because there was a part of her that understood, clearly, without drama, that being in that room right now would not be productive. She had a specific quality of anger about Warren Gould that was cold rather than hot, the kind that organized itself into precision rather than noise, and precision was more useful somewhere else. She went back to the trauma floor. Marcus was where she'd left him, managing a floor that had somehow continued functioning throughout all of this, which was its own kind of extraordinary. The secondary triage area had become a de facto operations center. Patients who could be moved had been moved, those who couldn't hadn't been. And Marcus had been running a verbal relay between the clinical staff and the soldiers on the upper floors for the past 90 minutes, with the methodical calm of someone who had decided that falling apart was not an option and had simply not revisited that decision. He looked up when she came in. He took in her jacket, her hands, the absence of the case she'd been carrying. "Castillo," she said, "do you have an update?" Ashwick Regional called in. "He's in surgery. Right side, the bullet missed the major vessels. They're saying good prognosis, couple of weeks." Marcus paused. "Who's Castillo?" "Young soldier. He walked Dr. Voss to the 4th floor." She sat down on the edge of a chair, just for a moment, just for the specific relief of not standing. "How's the vent patient on 4? "Stable. Voss is still up there." Marcus watched her. "You want to tell me what's going on? The whole thing, not the version that doesn't worry me. The whole thing will take a while. I've got time. The building's locked down, my staff are all present, and I've got soldiers in the hallways, so the usual concerns are covered." She looked at him for a moment. Marcus had been her charge nurse for 2 years. He'd covered for her 3 times on scheduling issues she hadn't fully explained. He told her once, early on, that she was the best trauma nurse he'd worked with, and then immediately complained about her paperwork, which she'd appreciated more than the compliment. "There's a patient on 3, she said. "ICU bed 3. His name is Daniel Farrow. He came in under a fake name, and people came here today to take something he was carrying. They think they got it." She paused. "They didn't." Marcus processed this. "And Gould?" Gould was aware the hospital had been identified as a transfer point. He knew what was coming. He didn't warn anyone, and he didn't stop it. She kept her voice flat. "That's the short version. The long version is worse. Almost always." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When you said this morning, In the hallway, when he was throwing you out. You said he'd regret it. Did you know then? I knew some of it. She stood back up. Not all of it. But you came back. I came back, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was revising his understanding of a colleague he thought he'd understood. Is there anything you need me to do? Keep the floor running, she said. Same as you've been doing. She moved toward the door. And Marcus, when this is over, there's going to be an investigation. People are going to ask you questions about Gould, about his management decisions, about any communications that seemed unusual. Answer honestly. Obviously, he said, slightly offended. I know. I'm saying it because some of those questions are going to make you uncomfortable. How uncomfortable? She was already in the hallway. The kind that makes you realize how long it was happening and how well it was hidden. The next hour was the hour that separated the controlled crisis from the uncontrolled one, and it separated them by a margin that was thinner than she would have liked. The fifth operative, the one who had cleaned up the South Side shooter before Pruitt's unit reached him, made his move at 5:14. He came through the basement level, which was the one approach they had covered with only one soldier, because the basement was a maze of service corridors, utility rooms, and connected infrastructure that would have required 4 people to cover properly, and they didn't have 4 people to spare. He had been in the building, she realized later, since before they arrived. He had come in clean, ahead of the others, and waited. The generator room was his target. Reyes caught him at the generator room door on pure instinct. The sound of the door handle 3 seconds before the door opened, the kind of sound you only notice when you've been standing in silence for an hour. And what followed was brief and rough, and not the kind of thing that looked like anything in a training scenario, which was fine because training scenarios were useful exactly up to the point where they weren't. Reyes got him contained. She took a hit to her left forearm that was going to leave a significant bruise and possibly a hairline fracture. She got him on the ground and called it in and sat on him until 2 soldiers came down the stairs, and then she stood up and held her arm against her chest and said, "Generators clear," into her radio with the steadiness of someone who had decided the arm could wait. Rebecca was at the basement level in under 3 minutes. She looked at the man on the ground, zip-tied, face down, saying nothing, and then at Reyes, who was holding her arm and looking at the wall with the expression of someone running through their own assessment. "Let me see it," Rebecca said. "I'm fine." "You're holding it like it's broken." "If it's broken, I don't want to know yet." Rebecca crouched in front of her and looked at the arm without touching it. "It's not broken. It's going to be spectacular colors by tomorrow, but the angle is wrong for a fracture." She stood. "Get it wrapped when someone's free. Don't wait too long." "Copy." Reyes looked at the man on the ground. He wasn't trying to cut power. "I know." Rebecca looked at the generator room door. He was trying to get to the power system. There's a difference. What's in a generator room besides a generator? Reyes thought. Utility conduits, junction panels, data infrastructure. Some hospitals run network cabling through the... She stopped. Rebecca was already moving. The data infrastructure node was behind the primary generator housing, a rack of network equipment that most hospital staff didn't know existed because most hospital staff had no reason to interact with it. It managed, among other things, the security camera system, the internal communication network, and the electronic health records routing. It also, she could now see, had a device attached to one of its access ports that had not been there before and was not part of the hospital's standard equipment. She looked at it without touching it. Small, black, wireless capable. The kind of device that could be used to extract or transmit data from a network it was connected to. "How long has this been here?" she said, not to Reyes but to herself. She got her answer in the form of a timestamp on the device's indicator light, a small red pulse that cycled every 3 seconds, which she'd seen on similar equipment and knew meant active transmission rather than standby. It was transmitting now, which meant whatever it was pulling from the system, it was pulling in real time. She looked at the device for 2 seconds. Then she reached into the rack and pulled the access port it was connected to. Not the device, the port, because removing the device from an active system could trigger a cascade depending on what it was designed to do. And the red light went from pulsing to solid and stopped. She stood up. "Tell Pruitt I need a digital forensics asset at the basement data node immediately." Whatever this was transmitting, I want to know to where and for how long. Copy. Reyes was already on the radio. Rebecca looked at the man on the floor. You were the advance team, she said. You came in yesterday, maybe 2 days ago. Got the device planted before anyone was looking. He said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. The attack today was cover. Everything else. The breach, the ICU, the parking structure. All of it was designed to pull attention up, while someone down here had access to the network. Nothing. The data case Farrow left was the contingency, she continued, still not expecting a response, just thinking out loud in the way she sometimes did when it helped to hear the structure of it. He knew there was a leak. He knew the primary documentation might be compromised or taken, so he carried the backup in a form that could be physically handed to someone he trusted, outside the network. She looked up at the ceiling of the generator room. Outside this network, she said, because this network has been compromised for a while. Pruitt arrived at the bottom of the stairs 60 seconds later with the forensics asset, a young woman named Park, who carried a laptop bag and had the intensely focused energy of someone who had been waiting in a vehicle for 2 hours to be useful and was relieved to have arrived at useful. How fast can you determine the transmission window on that device? Rebecca asked. Depends on what it was routing through. Give me 20 minutes. You have 15. Park sat down on the floor of the generator room with her laptop and got to work without complaint. Pruitt looked at Rebecca. You're thinking the network breach is longer than today. I'm thinking whatever Gould was involved in, data was moving out of this hospital through that node on a regular basis. Patient records, procurement orders, billing data. The fraud Gaines described, it ran through multiple hospitals. It needed infrastructure. It needed access. And Gould provided it. Gould managed it, she said. He's not smart enough to have designed it. Then who? Park said from the floor. Captain, you need to see this. Rebecca went to her. Park turned the laptop so she could see the screen. A log file, transmission records, timestamps going back 14 weeks. It's been active since late July, Park said. Regular intervals. Every 3 days, same window, 2 to 4 in the morning. It was pulling from the EHR system and the administrative network, billing, procurement, staffing records. She scrolled. But the last transmission before today is flagged. 3 days ago. It pulled something it hadn't pulled before. A file designated restricted access, personnel records, but the access tier is above hospital admin. Rebecca went still. It pulled from an external linked database, Park said. Military Medical Personnel Registry. Specifically, she stopped. She looked at Rebecca. She looked at the screen. She looked at Rebecca again. Say it, Rebecca said. It pulled your file, Park said. Your full service record. Everything classified, everything redacted in the standard version. It's all here in the transmission log. Someone was looking for you specifically 3 days before the attack. Park's voice was careful. And the device transmitted your record to the same destination it's been using for 14 weeks. The generator room was very quiet. What's the destination? Rebecca asked. Park typed something, waited, typed something else. The screen populated with routing data that had been layered through 3 relay points in a pattern that was clearly designed to obscure origin, but the final node resolved to something, because they always did if you knew where to press. Park read it. Her expression changed in a way that made Rebecca look at the screen herself. The destination was not a foreign IP. It was not an external server. It was a registered address associated with a building she knew. A building 4 miles from where she was standing, which was the administrative offices of the Ashwick Regional Health Authority, which was the regulatory body that oversaw Redwood Memorial's operating license, its budget allocation, its staffing certifications, and its board appointments, which meant the person receiving everything this network had been transmitting for 14 weeks, including her classified service record 3 days ago, was not outside the institution. They were at the top of it. She straightened. Her jaw was set in the way Pruitt recognized from circumstances he did not enjoy remembering. Get Gaines, she said. Pruitt already had his radio up. And Dale, she said, using his name the way she only did when the register shifted. However this ends tonight, whoever's at that address, it doesn't end quietly. He looked at her. Does it ever? She didn't answer because her radio chose that precise moment to come alive with Reyes's voice from the third floor, strained in a way that pulled Rebecca's attention up fast. "Captain, I see you. Pharaoh's awake. He's asking for you by name, and he's saying there's another device, one we haven't found." The generator room light hummed overhead. Rebecca was already moving toward the stairs. She took the stairs two at a time, not because panic drove her. Panic was a resource drain, and she'd learned to route around it a long time ago, but because the specific combination of Pharaoh is awake, and there's another device created a timeline problem that stairs solved faster than the elevator. Pruitt was behind her. She could hear him on the radio, pulling Reyes back to the ICU entrance, repositioning the soldier from the second floor to cover the third floor corridor access points. She pushed through the ICU door at a controlled pace. No running inside, not in front of patients, not in front of staff who were already operating at the edge of their composure, and crossed to bed 3. Daniel Pharaoh looked like a man who had been through something and was not pretending otherwise. He was 53, she now knew, though he looked older in the way that came not from age but from a specific kind of sustained stress. His color was poor, his lips were dry, he had the eyes of someone who had been waiting to be conscious for long enough that waking up felt like a deadline. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the recognition of a particular shape of person. "Hayes," he said. His voice was rough. "Pharaoh." She pulled the chair from beside the bed and sat in it, which put her at eye level and signaled that she was not in a hurry even though she was. "You left something for me. Did you open it?" "Not yet. Tell me about the second device first." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he was organized. "The network device in the basement. I knew about it. I helped plant the information that led to it being installed." She absorbed that. "You fed them a target. I needed to know who was receiving. We knew there was a leak in the oversight structure. We didn't know how high. The device was bait. We gave them a version of my documentation that was real enough to look legitimate, but contained a specific marker file. When they transmitted it, the marker would activate a trace protocol embedded in the file itself." He paused to breathe, which cost him something. "The trace takes 24 hours to complete. It routes through enough nodes to look clean, and then it resolves. You already knew the destination wasn't the endpoint. The Ashwick Regional Health Authority address is a pass-through. Whoever set it up is using the authority's network infrastructure, but they're not at the authority." He looked at her steadily. "The real destination is 3 hops further. The trace will finish tonight." "Then what's the second device?" Pharaoh's expression changed. It got heavier. "Before I came here, before the admission, before the cover identity, I was moved through 2 other locations, safe houses, in theory." He stopped. "They found both of them. I don't know how. I thought the leak was administrative, procurement level, but the response time was too fast. They knew my route within hours." She waited. "Someone with access to federal witness protection logistics was passing my location," he said. "That's not a hospital administrator. That's not even a regional oversight official." He looked at her directly. "Someone gave them my movement schedule 3 days ago, the same day your file was pulled." The timing landed the way he intended it to. She felt it. The precise, cold click of 2 things aligning that shouldn't have been in the same picture. "They weren't just looking for me," she said slowly. "They were looking for who was protecting you." "You weren't protecting me," he said. "You didn't know I existed. But your record, your real record, flags you as someone who would be assigned to a situation like this. Someone who would be brought in if a federal asset was in a compromised location." He paused. "Whoever pulled your file was trying to anticipate the response. They were trying to know who they'd be dealing with before they dealt with them." "And the second device," she said again. He looked at the ceiling. "I had a second copy of the documentation, not the case I left in the stairwell. That was the backup. The second device is a transmitter I've been carrying since I left the second safe house. It's been pinging a federal collection point every 6 hours with my location data. If I miss 2 consecutive pings, it triggers an automatic federal response. A different unit, higher clearance, full deployment." She looked at him. "And you've been unconscious since you were admitted." "I missed the 2 o'clock ping," he said. "And the 8 o'clock. That's 2. "Yes." So the federal response has either already been triggered or is about to be. He met her eyes. I don't know which, because I don't know what time it is. She told him. He closed his eyes again, briefly. Then it's already triggered. They'll be en route. He opened his eyes. The problem is they'll be coming in blind. They won't know the network here is compromised. They won't know the device in the basement. They won't know the oversight structure is involved. If whoever is at the end of that trace has any reach into federal communications, they'll know the response unit is coming before the response unit arrives, she said. And they'll have time to move, Pharaoh said, or to make sure certain things don't survive long enough to be evidence. She stood up. The chair scraped back. Pruitt, in the doorway, heard the change in her posture and was already straightening. Where's the transmitter now? She asked. Pharaoh looked at the bedside table, the personal effects tray. Well, the items Sierra had inventoried when he came in, the items that had been logged and stored because that was protocol. The tray was empty. She could see the indentation in the foam liner where several objects had been and were no longer. The inventory, she said. She turned. Sierra was already at the desk, pulling the admission log before Rebecca could ask for it. The items listed were one wallet, one watch, one phone in a cracked case, one small cylindrical object listed as medical alert device, personal, and one keycard of unknown affiliation. She looked at Sierra. Where are these now? Sierra pulled up the secure storage protocol on her screen. Admission personal effects go to the secure cabinet at the nurses' station on the admitting floor, locked, key held by charge staff. She paused. Which is currently Marcus, Rebecca said. She was already out the door. Marcus had the key. Of course he did. He was the charge nurse. It was his floor. And in the chaos of the afternoon, nobody had thought to specifically flag the personal effects cabinet as a high-value target because it was a standard secure cabinet in a nurse's station, the kind of fixture so ordinary that it functioned as furniture. You stopped seeing furniture. He unlocked it without question the moment she asked, which she noted and appreciated without saying so. And the tray was inside, and the contents matched the inventory log. All of them, including the small cylindrical object in the fourth position. She picked it up. It was the size and weight of a large pen, no obvious markings, a seam around the midpoint that suggested it separated into two pieces, and at one end a small recessed button she could feel with her thumb but not see. That's it, she said, not a question. She needed to make a decision in the next 30 seconds, and the decision had two options and neither of them was clean. Option 1. She left the transmitter as it was and let the federal response unit come in blind, hoping that the trace on Pharaoh's marker file resolved before whoever was at the end of it could react to the incoming unit. Option 2. She used the transmitter to send a signal, not a distress ping, but a communication, if the device had that capability, which she didn't know yet, and tried to get information to the incoming unit before they walked into a situation they weren't prepared for. The risk with option 1 was a federal unit arriving at a compromised environment with no briefing. The risk with option 2 was that she didn't know this device, she didn't know its protocols, and pressing the wrong sequence on something built for federal witness protection could do any number of things she hadn't anticipated. She pressed the seam. The device separated. Inside the upper half was a small display, 4 characters wide, currently reading a string of numbers she recognized as a status code format. The lower half had a secondary button and a small port. Pruitt looked over her shoulder. Do you know what you're doing? No, she said, which she meant as information rather than admission of failure. But I know what this format is. We used a similar system in... She stopped herself. I've seen this before. She pressed the secondary button twice, paused, pressed it once. The display changed. A different code. Transmission ready, if she was reading the format correctly. She pressed the primary button. The display cycled once and held on a single character that meant sent in the system she recognized. That's either going to the right people, she said, or to nobody, because I may have just cleared a transmission queue that had already fired. She put the device in her jacket. Either way, we move as if the unit is already en route and uninformed. What do we tell Gaines? Everything, she said. Right now. Gaines was still in Gould's office, which had taken on the quality of an operations center that nobody had officially designated as one. He had his own radio, his own laptop, and a second person she hadn't met. A woman named Torres, who handled the kind of communications that Gaines described only as federal coordination, and who had been on a continuous call since Gaines had arrived. Torres looked up when Rebecca came in. She looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had been briefed on a person and was now correlating the briefing with the reality. Rebecca gave Gaines the full picture in 4 minutes. The transmitter, the missed pings, the incoming federal unit, the trace that was still resolving, the pass-through at the Oversight Authority, the probability that whoever was at the real end of the trace had reach into federal communications infrastructure. Gaines listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "The unit en route is a 6-person response team. They're not read in on any of this. Can you reach them directly?" "I can reach their coordinator." He looked at Torres. "I'm already on it," Torres said, not looking up from her screen. "There's a second problem," Rebecca said. "If the person at the end of the trace has communications access, they may already know the unit is coming, which means they have 2 choices: run or make sure the evidence trail disappears before anyone reaches them." "What evidence trail is left?" Gaines asked. "The marker file transmission log is in the device." "The device in the basement, yes. But there's more. 14 weeks of transmissions from this hospital's network. That data went somewhere and was stored somewhere. If they decide to clean it, they need time and access." "How long does the trace take to resolve?" Farrow said tonight. Gaines checked his watch. "That's a 6-hour window, minimum." "Then we need to close it." "I can't move on the trace destination until the trace completes and I have a verified address. If I send assets to the wrong location—" "I know," she said. "I'm not saying move on the destination. I'm saying secure the data device in the basement so nothing in that transmission log gets touched. And I'm saying make sure Gould does not speak to anyone external from this point forward. Not his lawyer, not his board contacts, not anyone." She looked at him steadily. Whoever's at the end of that trace, Gould is a connection point. If he makes one call— "Understood." Gaines looked at Torres again. Torres nodded. Rebecca left the office. Pruitt fell in beside her. "What now?" he said. "We wait," she said, which was one of the things she was worst at, and he knew it, and neither of them said anything about that. The waiting had texture to it. It was not the empty waiting of an uneventful shift, the clock watching, the restless movement between one unnecessary task and another. It was the tight, compressed waiting of a situation that was still in motion and demanded attention even when there was temporarily nothing to act on. She used the time the way she always had, moving through the building, checking each position, verifying each status. Not because she distrusted the people holding those positions, but because movement kept her calibrated and because the floor gave her information that the radio didn't. The clinical staff had settled into a sustained competence that she found, privately, remarkable. Marcus had the trauma floor running. Dr. Voss had come down from 4 and was managing the post-bypass patient on 6 remotely with phone check-ins every 20 minutes. Sierra had not left the ICU. The hospital was doing what hospitals did, absorbing an extraordinary circumstance and continuing to function within it because the patients didn't stop needing care because the building had been breached. She stopped at the trauma bay on her second pass-through and stood in it for a moment. The overturned gurney had been righted by someone, at some point. The crash cart was back against the wall. The doors that had been forced were braced shut with equipment carts from the supply corridor, which was Marcus's solution to a problem that maintenance couldn't address until the building was cleared. She was standing there, looking at nothing in particular, when she heard footsteps she recognized. Harlan Voss came into the bay and stopped a few feet from her. He was 62 and had been a surgeon for 34 years, and he had the quiet of a man who had spent 3 decades in rooms where things either went right or they didn't, and had made a certain peace with that variable. He looked at her with an expression that had none of the recalibration she'd been seeing in people's faces all afternoon. None of the "I didn't know who you were" adjustment. He looked at her the same way he always had, which she found unexpectedly settling. "The bypass patient is good," he said. "Pressure's normalizing." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, then, "When Gould called you insubordinate this morning, in the hallway," She didn't say anything. I was in the supply corridor, he said. I heard it. I didn't come out. He paused. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him. Why are you telling me? Because I've been here 19 years and I've seen him do that to people before, and I never came out of whatever room I was in when it happened. And I think someone should say that plainly, instead of waiting for an investigation to make it official. She thought about what to say. She settled on, I appreciate that, Dr. Voss. Harlan, he said. She nodded once. He left. She stood in the bay for another 30 seconds, and then she moved on. Because the floor still needed watching, and standing still for longer than necessary was a habit she'd never developed. The trace resolved at 9:47 in the evening. Torres got it first, and Gaines had it within 30 seconds, and Rebecca heard it through the radio 40 seconds after that, because Pruitt was in the room when it came through. She was on the second-floor corridor when he told her. She stopped walking. The destination was not an office building. It was not a remote server location or a shell company's registered address. It was a residential property, a private residence in the Caldwell Heights neighborhood of Ashwick, which was the kind of neighborhood where houses had names and driveways were long enough that the street noise didn't carry. The property was registered to a woman named Margaret Olle. Margaret Olle was the chair of the Ashwick Regional Health Authority's board of directors. She had been in that position for 7 years. She had appointed Warren Gould to the directorship of Redwood Memorial 4 years ago. She had served on 3 federal healthcare advisory committees. She had 2 commendations from the state health department. She was 71 years old, and she had been receiving stolen medical data, procurement records, personnel files, and federal witness location intelligence through a device planted in the basement of the hospital she nominally oversaw for 14 weeks. Rebecca processed this for exactly the amount of time it took her to walk from the second-floor corridor to the first-floor administrative wing, which was about 90 seconds. She found Gaines in the corridor outside Gould's office. Ole, she said, we have a team moving to the residence now. His voice was controlled in the way of someone managing the gap between what they wanted to say and what was appropriate to say. Torres reached the Federal Response Unit. They're rerouting. They'll approach the residence as secondary support. She'll be gone. Maybe. She's 71 and she's been doing this for 4 years without getting caught. She's not careless. Rebecca's voice was flat. She heard the ping from the response unit. She heard the trace activate when we triggered Pharaoh's transmitter. She checked her watch. 6 hours. She'll be gone. Gaines looked at her. The data trail won't be gone. The marker file, the transmission logs, the device records. I know she'll face consequences eventually. She stopped herself. How long does eventually take? He was quiet for a moment. These things take time. They do, she said, because it was true and arguing with it didn't change it. What about Gould? Gould is being processed now. He's talking. Gaines paused. He's been talking since about an hour after Torres made it clear to him that cooperation was his only available option. He's given us names, accounts, a communication timeline going back 3 years. Another pause. He knew about Ola. He didn't know everything. She compartmentalized, but he knew enough. What did he get out of it? Budget protection, Gaines said. The hospital's funding review was scheduled twice in the past 3 years. Both times the review was quietly deprioritized. Redwood Memorial's budget stayed intact. Gould's position stayed intact. He looked somewhere past her shoulder. He thought he was being smart. She thought about the hallway that morning, the suit, the walk, the specific confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. He wasn't protecting the hospital, she said. He was protecting his version of it. No, Gaines agreed. He wasn't. She turned away. She needed a minute that wasn't a conversation, and she took it, walked to the end of the administrative corridor, stood at the window that looked out over the main lot. The military vehicles were still there. The lot lights were on. It was almost 10 o'clock, and Ashwick was doing what cities did at 10 on a Tuesday, settling, quieting, unaware. She thought about Margaret Olle in a house in Caldwell Heights, and she thought about 4 years of data moving out of this building in the early hours of the morning, and she thought about the patients whose records had been in that transmission, and the staff whose information had flowed through that node to a destination they'd never consented to and never known about. She thought about Pharaoh in the ICU, who had spent weeks in transit and cover and compromise to get a data case to a federal review panel, and who had been smart enough to leave a backup in a stairwell for someone he'd identified through a classified file as the person most likely to find it. She thought about her classified file and what was in it that made him trust her specifically, and whether she agreed with his assessment of that trust, and she decided that was a question for a different night. Her radio crackled. Torres's voice. "Captain Hayes, I need you in the administrative wing, conference room." Something in the tone made her turn away from the window immediately. The conference room had acquired more people in the last hour. 2 federal agents she didn't recognize, Torres's people clearly, from the way they moved and the equipment they'd brought in. A laptop on the table running a live feed, and Gould sitting in the corner, who had a look she hadn't seen on him before and couldn't immediately name. Then she understood. It was the look of a man who was no longer performing. The suit still fit. The posture was still there. But whatever had been animating the performance, the certainty, the weight of institutional authority he carried like ballast, was gone, and without it, he was just a man in an expensive suit in a corner, looking smaller than the chair. "We have contact with the residents," Torres said. "Our team is on site." "And?" Rebecca said. Torres looked at her screen. "She's there." Rebecca absorbed that. "You said she'd be gone." "I said maybe," Gaines said from behind her. "She's there," Torres said again. "She answered the door. She let them in." Torres looked up. "She's been waiting." Silence. Rebecca looked at Gaines. He had the look of someone who was also recalibrating. "Waiting," she said. "She asked for senior federal representation," Torres said. "She has documentation of her own, financial records, communication logs, the full structure of the network. She's been keeping it for—" Torres checked something on the screen. "Her words are an appropriate moment." Gould made a sound in the corner, not a word. A sound. "She built the network," Rebecca said. Not a question. "It appears so," Gaines said carefully, "and she documented it. Every transaction, every communication, every person involved." Torres was reading as she spoke. "She's offering it in exchange for a specific agreement. She's not running, she's negotiating." "She's 71, Rebecca said. "She's been doing this for 4 years. She knows the data trail exists. She knows we have the transmission logs, the device, the marker file." She looked at the table. She decided that the best position she could be in was the one who handed it over voluntarily, rather than the one who got dragged. "It's a strong position legally," Gaines said, with the tone of someone who found this professionally infuriating. "It's a calculated position," she said. "Same thing she's been doing for 4 years." She looked at the laptop screen, though the feed was only text. The team's communications coming in real time. "What does she want?" "Medical supervision during processing," Torres said. "She has a cardiac condition. She wants a physician present." Torres looked up from the screen. "She's specifically requested the trauma department at Redwood Memorial." The room was quiet. Rebecca understood then exactly how Margaret Ohl had survived in a position like the one she occupied for as long as she had. The request was not about medical care. It was a message. Elegant, deliberate, the final move of someone who had been 3 steps ahead for so long that even capitulation looked like strategy. She was asking to be brought to the hospital she'd been plundering. She was asking to be processed through the institution where the evidence against her had been uncovered. She was making herself visible in the most specific way possible. "I know what you have. I know where we are. Here I am." "Tell them yes," Rebecca said. Gaines looked at her. "You want her brought here?" "She's asking for medical supervision. She has a cardiac condition. This is the trauma hospital in her district." Rebecca's voice was even. "Tell them yes. Bring her in through the main entrance." She didn't explain the rest of it, and Gaines didn't ask her to because he was a perceptive man and the rest of it was in her face plainly enough. Margaret Ohl had built a network that had moved through this hospital for 4 years. She had appointed the man who had humiliated Rebecca Hayes in a hallway that morning. She had received Rebecca's classified file and used it to anticipate a response. And now she was going to walk through the front entrance of Redwood Memorial under federal escort, past the staff she had exposed and the patients whose data she'd compromised and the soldiers who had spent the day securing the building she'd been using, and she was going to do it in front of all of them. That was not revenge. Rebecca did not particularly organize herself around revenge, but there was something clarifying about it, something that returned the sequence of the day to its correct shape, placed each thing where it belonged in relation to each other thing. Torres made the call. Gaines looked at Rebecca. "For what it's worth," he said, "Gould told us something else. When he called you insubordinate this morning, that was his word. Insubordinate. But the reason he moved against you today specifically was because Ola told him to," she said. "She flagged your file 3 days ago," Gaines said. "She told him you were a liability. She wanted you off the floor before anything happened." He paused. "She was worried about you specifically. Out of everyone in this building." Rebecca looked at the window, the lot lights, the ordinary night. "She was right to be," she said. 40 minutes later, at 10:53 in the evening, a federal vehicle pulled into the main entrance lane of Redwood Memorial Hospital. The soldiers in the lot watched it come in. Davis, who had been on a double shift and was going to need a week to process all of it, watched through the glass doors. Margaret Oles stepped out in a dark coat and walking shoes with 2 federal agents at her sides in the posture of a woman who had made a decision and intended to carry it through. She was smaller than Rebecca had expected somehow, white-haired, deliberate in her movement, with the careful walk of someone managing a body that required management. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like what she probably was in several contexts that had nothing to do with this one. She came through the front entrance. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at the staff visible through the trauma corridor window. She looked briefly at Davis. Then she looked at Rebecca, who was standing in the corridor entrance where she'd been standing when Gould had escorted her out that morning, and she held the look for a moment that was neither apologetic nor defiant. "Captain Hayes," she said, with the precision of someone who had known exactly what title to use and had chosen the moment for it. "Ms. Ola," Rebecca said. "This way." She turned and walked toward the clinical wing, and Margaret Ola followed her into Redwood Memorial Hospital, and behind them, Torres was already on a secure line to the Federal Review Panel, and in the ICU, Daniel Farrow was awake and asking Sierra what was happening, and in the conference room, Warren Gould was still sitting in the corner and had been for an hour, looking at nothing. And in the basement, behind the generator housing, the data device sat in Park's evidence bag, with 14 weeks of transmissions cataloged and logged and ready, and the marker file trace result was printed and time-stamped and in Gaines's hands, and the encrypted case from the stairwell was open on a federal analyst's laptop, and the documentation Farrow had carried across 3 compromised locations and 1 hospital admission was finally, for the first time, where it was always supposed to go. Down the hall from where all of this was being assembled, Marcus was charting. He looked up when Rebecca passed the nursing station. "She's admitted," he said, meaning Ola. "Observation Bay 2, Rebecca said. "Dr. Voss will cover." "Got it." He looked at her for a moment. "You doing okay?" She considered the question with more honesty than she usually applied to it. "I'll answer that in the morning," she said. He nodded. "I'll make coffee." She moved past the station and through the trauma corridor, checking the brace on the forced door out of habit, checking the corridor light that had been flickering since 3 in the afternoon and was still flickering now, checking the supply cabinet in the back hall that was labeled linens and was now empty in a way that felt oddly significant, like a room after furniture has been moved. She was almost to the stairwell when her radio came alive. It was Park. Her voice was controlled, but there was something in the frequency of it, a tightness, a specific quality of "I didn't expect this," that brought Rebecca's hand up to the radio before Park had finished the first sentence. "Captain, the transmission logs from the data device. I've been going through the full 14 weeks. A pause. "There are entries I flagged as anomalous because they didn't match the pattern of the other transmissions. Different file types, different timestamps, sent to the same destination but tagged with a secondary recipient code we hadn't identified yet." Another pause, shorter. "I ran the secondary code through the Federal Registry." Rebecca waited. "The secondary recipient," Park said, "has a classified designation. It's not a person. It's an office, a specific federal intelligence office. Her voice was careful now, each word placed. And the transmissions tagged to that office include your file, but not just your current file. Your full historical record, your deployment logs, your mission records, everything that was supposed to be sealed under the classification protocols that were applied when you left service. Rebecca stood very still in the corridor. Someone at that federal intelligence office requested your file, Park said. Not 3 days ago, 14 weeks ago, the same week the device went active. A breath. The data device wasn't just serving Ola. Someone else was watching this whole time, and they weren't watching Pharaoh. Park stopped. Then, Captain, they were watching you. The flickering corridor light held steady for 1 second, then went out entirely, and Rebecca stood in the dark hallway of Redwood Memorial Hospital and understood that the day she thought was ending had just opened into something considerably larger than a hospital, a director, and a 71-year-old woman in a dark coat. Her radio crackled once more and then went silent, and the backup lighting came on in pale amber. And somewhere above her, in Observation Bay 2, a monitor began to alarm. She moved toward the alarm before she understood what she was doing. That was the thing about years of training. The body didn't wait for the mind to finish processing. The monitor in Observation Bay 2 was alarming, and she was a trauma nurse in a hospital, and those two facts organized her feet before the weight of what Park had just told her could fully land. She tucked the radio and she moved, and the amber backup lighting made the corridor look like something underwater, pale and strange. And she pushed through the Bay 2 door with her hand already reaching for the monitor panel. Margaret Ola was awake. She had not coded. The alarm was a lead disconnect. One of the cardiac monitoring pads had come loose, probably from movement, and the monitor had interpreted the signal loss as a clinical event. Rebecca silenced it, checked the pad, reattached it, watched the rhythm normalize on screen. Sinus rhythm, irregular but not critically so, consistent with the documented cardiac history. Ole was watching her from the bed. She had the stillness of someone who had been very still for a long time and had learned to make it look like patience rather than exhaustion. False alarm, Rebecca said. I gathered, Ola said. Rebecca checked the other leads. She checked the BP cuff. She did the job she'd been trained to do, which was the job she'd come to this hospital to do 2 years ago. And she did it without performance, without commentary, without the weight of the last 12 hours bleeding into the clinical task in front of her. That was a discipline she'd built over years, and it held now the way it always held. Not easily, but it held. When she was satisfied with the monitor, she stepped back. Ola said, You're angry. I'm working, Rebecca said. You can be both. Ola's voice was dry, not unkind exactly, but without the texture of someone who was interested in being liked. I've been watching your file for 14 weeks, Captain. I know the difference between you working and you feeling something. Rebecca looked at her. Then you know I'm not going to have this conversation with you tonight. No, Ola agreed. Tonight you have other things to manage. She paused. Her eyes were sharp in a face that had aged around them. The secondary recipient code. Rebecca went still. I knew it would surface eventually, Ola said. I want you to know that I didn't know who they were when I agreed to the arrangement. Not at the beginning. By the time I understood what office I was actually feeding, the arrangement was... She stopped. Structural. The kind of thing that's easier to continue than to exit. You're telling me this now, Rebecca said, in a hospital bay, without your attorney. My attorney knows everything I'm about to tell you. I told him 3 hours ago. Ola's hands were flat on the blanket. Deliberate. The office that requested your file 14 weeks ago operates under a classification tier that I couldn't verify through normal channels. I know the designation. I know the routing. I don't know the name of the person who made the request. She paused. But I know why they wanted you watched. Rebecca waited. Because 4 years ago, in a location I was never given, Ola said, you extracted someone they didn't want extracted. Someone who knew things about a financial architecture that runs through multiple sectors, not just healthcare. Your mission was classified. The person you extracted gave testimony that went somewhere it apparently caused significant damage. Her eyes didn't waver. They've been looking for a reason to access your records since then. I gave them infrastructure. The amber light hummed. Rebecca had known, in the abstract way of someone who has been in classified operational contexts, that missions had downstream consequences, that the work didn't end when you came home, that the people on the wrong side of the things you'd done kept existing and kept having interests and kept working toward those interests in whatever ways their resources allowed. She had known this the way you know a weather pattern, intellectually, distantly. 14 weeks of surveillance made it concrete. "Who do I talk to?" she said. "Gaines knows the designation," Ola said. "He'll understand what it means. He'll know who to take it to." She paused. "I'm telling you this because the network I built served people who had specific objectives, and one of those objectives was you. You deserve to know that clearly, not from a report, from me." Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. She felt several things simultaneously, and none of them were simple, and she did not attempt to simplify them. Anger, yes. Something that wasn't exactly respect but was in that neighborhood. The recognition of a capable person who had used that capability for the wrong ends and knew it and had decided to face that without softening it into something more comfortable. Weariness. The deep structural kind that didn't come from one long day, but from the accumulated weight of a life that had required a particular quality of sustained vigilance. "Get some sleep," she said, and left the bay. She found Gaines at 11:43 in the administrative corridor, and she gave him the designation code that Ola had provided. She watched his face when she said it. He had good control gains, but not perfect, and what moved through his expression in the 2 seconds after she spoke was enough to confirm that Ola had been telling the truth about the tier. "That's a problem," he said. "Tell me something I don't know." "The problem is that acting on it requires a level of authorization that I don't have tonight. It requires documentation, a formal complaint channel, probably a congressional notification depending on how the charter reads." He looked at her steadily. "It's not a problem I can solve before morning. Can it be solved?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, which she appreciated. "It will take time, and it will be unpleasant for several people in positions they thought were insulated. But the transmission logs, the device records, the routing data, all of that is evidence of unauthorized surveillance of a classified military record. That's not a gray area." He paused. "You have grounds, solid ones." "Then we start in the morning," she said. "We start in the morning," he agreed. She nodded. She walked away. She went to the nursing station, where Marcus had made coffee at some point in the last hour, and she poured a cup she didn't particularly want and stood at the counter and drank half of it looking at the wall. Marcus came by, charting, and didn't say anything, which was the correct instinct. After a while she said, "How's the floor?" "Quiet," he said. "Actual quiet. Nobody's crashing, nobody's coding. The vent patient on 4 is weaning ahead of schedule, and the bypass on 6 is asking for jello, which is always a good sign." "It is," she said. "The soldiers are still in the building. They'll start pulling out in the morning. One unit stays on the ICU until Farrow is transferred to Federal Medical." She finished the coffee. "You should go home, Marcus." "Second shift is here," he said. "I'm overtime. I've been overtime since about 2 this afternoon." He looked at her sideways. "You should go home." "I will." That didn't sound convincing. "I know." He laughed, short and real, and it was the first ordinary sound she'd heard in 12 hours, and it landed somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She did not go home that night. She stayed until 3 in the morning, not because the situation required her, but because she was a person who needed to see things through to the natural end of a watch. And the natural end wasn't a clock time, it was a state. The state of a situation being stable enough that leaving it didn't feel like abandonment. At 3, it felt stable. Farrow was improving. Ola was under federal observation and her own cardiac status was holding. The soldiers on perimeter had settled into the routine quiet of people who have been told to hold and are holding. The clinical floors were running on second shift with nobody crashing. She got in her truck and drove home, and she sat in the driveway of the rental house she'd lived in for 2 years without hanging anything on the walls. And she sat there for probably 10 minutes looking at the cracked side mirror, and then she went inside and slept for 5 hours without dreams. which was the best she usually managed. The next 6 weeks were not a clean resolution. They were a process, which was different, and the difference mattered. Warren Gould was formally arrested on the 3rd day and remanded pending federal charges that included conspiracy, obstruction, and a series of financial fraud violations that his cooperation had ironically helped document in detail. His cooperation did not insulate him. It reduced his exposure on some counts and eliminated it on others, but the core charges held, and he entered a guilty plea on the 31st day that carried a sentence of 7 years, which was 2 less than the maximum and 5 more than his attorney had initially suggested was possible. He was processed out of Redwood Memorial's directorship on day 1. His parking space was empty by the end of the morning. Margaret Ola's situation was more complicated, as Rebecca had expected it to be. The voluntary surrender, the documented evidence, the formal cooperation agreement, all of it had the effect Ola had calculated, which was a negotiated outcome rather than a prosecuted one. She pled to 2 counts, received a sentence of house arrest and a financial penalty that was substantial but not ruinous, and surrendered her position on the Health Authority Board and every affiliated committee simultaneously. Her attorney released a statement. She did not. The network itself took longer. The 7 hospitals it had run through were identified, audited, and subject to federal oversight for a period of 18 months. 3 other administrators were charged. A procurement contractor whose name had appeared in the transmission log 17 times was arrested in a different state 6 weeks later. The financial flows that had moved through the system over 4 years were traced to their endpoints, and the endpoints were in 3 different financial institutions and required 2 separate court orders to access. It was not fast. It was not satisfying in the way that fast would have been satisfying, but it was thorough, and thoroughness was what made it durable. The classified federal office that had requested Rebecca's file through Ola's device was the piece that took the longest and made the most people uncomfortable in the highest positions. Gaines filed the formal complaint on day 2 with documentation from Park's transmission logs. The congressional notification went out on day 4. The investigation that followed was handled by an oversight body that Gaines described only as appropriate and that Rebecca chose not to press him on because she understood institutional processes well enough to know that some of them required patience from the people who had the most reason to be impatient. What she knew, by the end of the 6 weeks, the individual who had authorized the surveillance request against her record had been placed on administrative leave. The authorization had been done outside proper channels, which the oversight body characterized in language she found aggressively mild, but which nonetheless had legal teeth. She would not know the full outcome for months. She had been told, by someone Gaines trusted, that the outcome would be appropriate. She chose to accept that for now, because the alternative was spending energy she didn't have on a timeline she couldn't control, and she had learned a long time ago that there were battles you fought and battles you watched, and the skill was in knowing which was which. On the 38th day, Redwood Memorial's interim directorship was assigned to a woman named Dr. Carol Wentworth, who had previously overseen the clinical operations of a trauma center in a different state and who walked the floor on her first morning and introduced herself to every member of the nursing staff by name. She found Rebecca at the trauma bay charting and sat down across from her without preamble. "I've read your personnel file," Wentworth said, "the real one and the hospital one." "Which did you start with?" Rebecca asked. "The hospital one. Then I read the real one and understood why the hospital one was thin." She paused. "I want to talk about what you want. Not what the hospital needs, not what the Federal Review recommends. What you want." Rebecca looked at her. Wentworth was 50-something, direct, with the particular efficiency of someone who had run a trauma center and been shaped by it the way trauma centers shaped people. Stripped of decoration, focused on function, but not unkind. Not unkind was important. "I want to keep working," Rebecca said. "Here?" "This is my floor," she said, and meant it in the specific way of someone who had bled for a thing without advertising the bleeding. Wentworth nodded. "There's also a proposal on the table from the military medical liaison, a training role, joint civilian-military trauma curriculum. They want someone who can bridge both sides." She looked at Rebecca directly. "They specifically asked for you." "Pruitt," Rebecca said. "The recommendation came through a warrant officer, Pruitt, yes." She thought about it for a moment. Not long. She'd been thinking about it since Pruitt had looked at her in the parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon that felt considerably longer ago than 38 days. Both, she said. Wentworth raised an eyebrow. The floor and the training role. Part-time split, coordinated schedule. I'm not leaving the clinical work. She paused. I came here to work a trauma floor. I'm still here. That means something. It does, Wentworth said. She stood. I'll make it work. She left without making it a bigger moment than it was, which Rebecca appreciated more than she could have said. The formal recognition came on day 42, and Rebecca did not ask for it, had not been told it was coming, and would have found a reason to be somewhere else if she'd known in advance. She was in the supply corridor, the real supply corridor, the one with the cabinet that used to say linens, when Marcus found her and said there were people in the main conference room who needed 5 minutes of her time, and she knew from his face that it was not a clinical matter, and she started to form a refusal, and he said quietly, Rebecca, 5 minutes. She went. The conference room held Pruitt, in dress uniform, which she had not seen him in for 3 years, Torres, Gaines, Dr. Voss, who was standing near the window with his hands in his coat pockets, Sierra, who had clearly been crying recently and was equally clearly pretending she hadn't, Marcus, who came in behind her, Davis, in his security uniform, standing straight in a way that suggested he'd been practicing for this, and Castillo, who was in a chair because he was 3 weeks out of surgery and not cleared to stand for extended periods, and who looked embarrassed about the chair in the specific way of young soldiers who found sitting down in formal contexts uncomfortable. She stopped in the doorway. Pruitt stepped forward. He was holding a folder, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was now deciding whether the rehearsal had been useful. This is not official in the way official usually looks, he said. We don't have a stage. We don't have a PA system. Half the people in this room have no standing to be here for a military commendation, technically. He paused. But the people who needed to be here are here, so we're doing it this way. He opened the folder. He read the language of the commendation. It was formal, specific, and cited actions and a service record in terms that required the classified designation to be spoken aloud in this room, in front of people who did not all have clearance for it, and he did it anyway, which was technically a protocol violation and also exactly right. When he finished reading, he looked up. Captain Hayes, he said, on behalf of the unit, and personally, thank you. She looked at the room, at Castillo in his chair, who was nodding with the focused sincerity of someone very young who understood that they were alive because of a specific decision made by a specific person. At Sierra, who had caught a tampered IV line in the middle of a crisis because something had felt wrong and she'd trusted that feeling. At Davis, who had walked her out of this building in the morning and followed her back into it in the afternoon without anyone asking him to. At Marcus, who made terrible coffee and knew when to talk and when not to, which was rarer than competence and almost as valuable. At Voss, who had come out of a supply corridor and said, I know that I didn't, plainly, without waiting for anyone to ask. She thought about what she wanted to say, and she found that she didn't want to say very much, because the room was already full of the thing that mattered, and adding more words to it would not improve it. Castillo, she said. He looked at her. Captain, how's the side? 3 more weeks until I'm cleared for field PT, he said. Surgeon says I'm ahead of schedule. Of course you are, she said. You held a field pressure dressing on yourself while directing me to a secondary shooter. That's not something the average person does. He looked at his hands. I had good instruction, he said, which was quietly the nicest thing anyone had said to her in recent memory. She looked at Pruitt. I need to get back to the floor. I know, he said, but... She stopped herself, started again. I've been doing this, the quiet version of this, the staying small version, for 2 years. Not because I was ashamed of the record, because I thought it was what the situation required. Coming in without the weight of it, just being a nurse, just doing the job. She looked at the room. I was wrong about that. Not wrong to do the work was real, but wrong to think that being underestimated was the same as being safe. It's not. She paused. The people in this room, everyone in this building who held their position today when it would have been easier not to, You didn't hold it because it was safe. You held it because it was yours. She looked at Castillo. That's what I want you to remember, not me. That. Castillo nodded. His jaw was set in the way of someone who was not going to cry in a conference room but was making some effort to arrange that. She left the room. In the hallway, she stood still for about 30 seconds, which was longer than she usually allowed herself to stand still, and she let the day, all 42 days, the whole accumulated weight of them, sit in her chest without trying to compress it into something smaller than it was. It was heavy. That was fine. Heavy things could be carried. She'd been carrying heavy things for a long time and she was still walking, which was the point. Then she tied her hair back, checked the trauma pager clipped to her waistband, and went back to work. The corridor was the same corridor it had always been. Linoleum, fluorescent, the particular antiseptic smell that became invisible after the first week and then came back when you were tired. The crash cart was where it belonged. The nursing station was running. Somewhere on the floor, a monitor beeped in the steady rhythm of a heart doing its ordinary work of continuing, which was, when you stripped everything else away, the whole point of every hour she'd spent in this building. She passed the supply cabinet that no longer said linens. Someone had finally removed the tape, at some point, and the bare metal underneath was the same beige as everything else. Unremarkable, just another piece of the wall. She checked 2 patients on her way back to the station, both stable. She updated the chart on a post-op who was overdue for a vitals check and had not been flagged, which was a documentation gap she closed without comment because documentation gaps got people hurt, and preventing that was the work. And the work was what she'd come back for. She'd come back for it on the morning when Gould had walked her out, and she'd sat in a truck with a cracked mirror and a text from an unsaved number and had said, "All right" to nobody. She'd come back for it with soldiers behind her and a tactical case over her shoulder and full knowledge of what she was walking into. She came back for it now in the ordinary way. Pager, scrubs, corridor. Because the ordinary way was what made the rest of it possible. The battlefield discipline was real. The classified record was real. The commendation was real. But so was this: a ward, a patient, a chart, a nurse doing the job that needed doing because the job needed doing and she was the one there to do it. Some people spent their whole lives trying to be seen as more than what a room decided they were at first glance. Some of them shaped themselves around that need until the need was bigger than the person. She understood the feeling. She'd had it in various corridors at various points in her life, and she knew exactly how much weight it could carry and exactly how little it was worth in the end. What she'd learned, not that morning, not in the last 42 days, but across the whole arc of a life that had taken her from basic training to classified deployments to a trauma floor in a mid-sized city with a cracked truck mirror and a cabinet that used to say linens, was this: being underestimated was not the problem. The problem was if you started to believe it. The moment you built your identity around what other people failed to see, you handed them something they didn't deserve. Your attention, your energy, your shape. She had not finally been seen when Gould called her insubordinate in that hallway. She had not been seen when the soldiers arrived and the command passed to her and the staff recalibrated their understanding of who was standing among them. She had not been seen even in a conference room with a commendation folder. She had always been exactly who she was. That was the thing that didn't require acknowledgement to be true. It was true before the hallway and after it. True in the supply corridor with the tactical case. True in the stairwell, the generator room, the ICU. True in the morning in a driveway looking at a cracked mirror. The work confirmed it. The work always confirmed it. That was why she came back. She pulled the next chart. She read it. She went to do what it required. Down the hall, the monitor kept its rhythm, steady, ordinary. Enough.